Welcome to Disambiguation. I'm your host, Michael Fauscette. Each week, we interview experts in artificial intelligence, generative AI, and business automation to help business leaders understand how to use these tools for the biggest business impact. Our show today is Securing the Agentic Coding Era. When AI writes code, who guards the gates? I'm joined by Nir Valtman, co-founder and CEO of Arnica. Nir, welcome.
Hey, Michael. Thanks for having me.
So just to get us started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and the path that led you to found Arnica? And I know you've had a pretty wide ranging security career, from Israeli Army to CISO at Cabbage and VP of Security at Finastra. So just give us a little bit of an overview.
Yeah, so, historically I've been a hacker. I know that hacker has a wide term, but in essence, my parents actually sent me to a Visual Basic coding when I was young. It was a nice training, and I just didn't like to build. I liked to break things. So I actually got kicked out because I took the lab down, and I said, "This is exactly what I want to do."
This is fun.
This is so fun. But long story short, I ended up doing some IT and security stuff in the army in Israel when I lived there. Later on, I did some consulting roles, had different pieces of experience in penetration testing. Again, the bad side, the good for the good guys, and later on managed to progress to different roles and more of the kind of management side, up to the point in which last job I was actually tasked to solve application security as one of the pieces of the role, and essentially I really looked for a vendor to solve the challenges that we had, the low adoption with the developers, and the kind of solve the conflict between developers and security. And I really didn't find the right solution for us. I wanted to buy, just didn't find it. And that was one of the triggers to eventually go and found the company. In my good luck, I actually had a couple of really good mentors, and they helped me to make this decision. And a few months later, the previous employer became a customer. So that was kind of really nice to see this full cycle, because they really needed a solution, and I was right there to actually solve it.
Cool. Well, I know the SolarWinds attack a few years ago was a turning point for a lot of security leaders, and I know it raised awareness, certainly. And you told me when we were chatting before a bit about when you were at Finastra, it happened, and your CEO asked you, what were we doing to prevent it, and somehow that's a part of this path to founding Arnica. Can you give us a little bit about how that crisis question turned into a company?
Yeah, so in essence, it's a public information that Arnica has been, not Arnica, Finastra back then was breached. We were front page on Krebs. So obviously our leadership in the company had very low appetite to risk. One, because it was a financial services company, so we already had low appetite for risk. But it amplified after the breach, that just had to do more. And in essence, I had a really phenomenal team at Finastra, where some of them were kind of more of the very senior security leaders that spoke at the GM level, and some of them were really the penetration testing, the hardcore team members. But still, in the large company like Finastra, we had to scale the practice, and we had to understand exactly what is where. And with the amount of code changes we released, we had to understand which tools are running where, and what is considered production, and what is passing SLA, and essentially these are the challenges that we tried to solve, and we built an internal tool for this. Thing is that there was a limit to how much we could build. And in that case, I wrote most of the code during my free time. So we ended up, I've got this challenge when SolarWinds actually happened from the CEO, and he actually asked, "What are we doing about this?" I didn't have back then a good enough answer, but I had to do some research. We found some
Mhm.
pieces that contributed to this root cause that it happened, and later on, I came back to back then it was our CTO, and I said, "Hey, I know what we need to do to solve this, but we checked other products and didn't find anything. So we actually can build this, but I need a two pizza team in Amazon terms. It's a team that can eat two pizzas, and I need 1 year, and we'll build this, and we'll have the right solution." And this is pretty much where everything was born.
Mm.
And kicked off the process towards Arnica.
Yeah. Well, so to set the stage for this conversation a little, we hear in a lot of noise in the media about, up to 30% of the code in some organizations is AI generated. And frankly, based on my conversations and work, I suspect that number's low. But anyway, for business leaders, when they hear that, they think, "Yay, that's great. We're really moving fast." But they don't really ask the security question. So I'm curious, like, what do you think? What's the security really, that they're not seeing?
So I think that there are a few ways to look at that. Yes, there is more code generated by AI, and we see almost every customer of ours using AI, not in a full capacity yet.
Yeah.
But Microsoft CTO projects that roughly 90% of the new code will be generated by AI by 2030. So we have some time, but it's progressing, and it's progressing very fast. Now, the thing is that AI coding tools, they are designed to build a workable product. So when they are connected to your repo and they have the context of your repo, they will make the tests pass. They will make the functionality work as much as they can. But essentially, the way they're thinking about building those features is by repeating other behaviors in the product, such as, this is how a service looks like. Let me introduce another service that looks like that.
Mm.
At the same token, if there's a specific vulnerability that is repeated in the product, it will be very likely going to be repeated in the next feature. So more code doesn't
Mm.
necessarily mean secure by default. More code
Right.
means more risks. It also means more bugs. But there are definitely a couple of pieces of research that I found. One that claims that roughly with AI coding, you'll see roughly 45% more bugs and
Mm.
roughly 40% more security vulnerabilities in load of
Mm.
vulnerabilities. And that actually brings actually another question. So let's say that you introduce those vulnerabilities, then who's accountable for those vulnerabilities? And there's another research actually that shows that only 13% of the code generated by AI is actually attributed back to the developer. So the vast majority of the new code is not attributed back to the developer, which also back then brings the question of who is equipped to review any changes there and who is equipped to actually fix anything that comes up later.
Mm.
Follow on
I,
that. Yeah.
no, sorry, go
Just
ahead.
follow on that. It means just that you need way more time spent on reviews.
Yeah.
And way more time spent on reviews, it means that both the devs are less productive, and there's some hidden costs behind this. If you want, we'll talk about it. And there's
Mm.
also, developers get the productivity gains, but the security team suddenly don't. And now they
Mm.
have a huge overload of issues they need to review, and they're not
Mm.
necessarily equipped to address this.
Yeah. I mean, we talk about how quickly you can develop code, using agentic AI, and that's exciting. It's certainly, it's a conversation that gets people involved, engaged, right? But if you think about it, you've sort of framed this for me, and I think about this a lot. That let's undertrained, basically low level development type skills, commit code at machine speed. So we've speeded up a process that is not an advanced coding process, and that's pretty vivid in my mind when you say that. And what does that really look like from a application security team queue on a Monday morning?
Yeah, so I think that boils down to how can you guide the these coding agents to write this secure code by default, right? And I don't know, maybe not all of the audience heard about Cloud Skills and cursor
Mm.
rules, and GitHub has Copilot instructions. And,
Yep.
essentially every AI coding tool has something that it respects when it starts working on a task. That's just how agentic coding works.
Yeah.
And the thing is that uh, let's assume that all tools in the market already have an underlying prompt that says build it securely. Okay, let's assume that. Okay, uh, the next level is really going after specifics. So you can build a framework based prompt, a skill that goes to those types of markdown files, and say, hey, you know what? Let's build it based on a framework like an OWASP ASVS, which is the Application Security Validation Standard.
Hmm.
And but in that case, we want it to be very thoughtful about what it prompts the agent to do. For example, if you already have an authentication mechanism in the service, you don't want the agent to override it with a more secure authentication mechanism because it will break the app, right? And at the same time, if you have, let's say, a specific way to access the database, and now you have a prompt that says, hey, now don't allow any dynamic queries in the database, it will create a new method to access the database, and that will be secure by default. Okay,
Yeah.
so that's why I'm saying that it needs to be very thoughtful about
Yeah.
uh, what the agent actually needs to do with new features.
Mhm. I mean, we think about it. We talk a lot about the code gen tools, that they're capable of, and are really optimized for speed and for outcome, right? For whether the code actually compiles. But I don't hear much talk about security at all. And I know when we were talking before, you pointed out that this, trying to enforce security at a model level can be really expensive. Token costs are high, and it's hard to justify. I mean, how do you solve that? Is the security later always going to have to live outside the model, or is there some solution to that?
I think there's a combination, right? At the end of the day, there is what you can do uh, at the time of code generation, right?
Mm.
What you can do is you can give it something like a prompt, and that will be limited to what you tell it to do. All right. So the challenge today with models is not the input that you provided, it's the output. Right. So for
Mm.
example, if you give it a if let's say that you hypothetically come up with a prompt that says fix all of the vulnerabilities the next time that you introduce a new feature.
Yeah.
Can it do it? Hypothetically, yes. Practically, it will likely break all the other functionality, but this is where you need to be very thoughtful on the code generation side. But
Mm.
let's say that code generation is just one piece. What happens when the code is ready, right? When the code is ready and it doesn't have the right guardrails, then there's a hidden cost of reprompting, retesting, and especially this is where you see pretty much most of the security tools interact at this pull request or the code review stage, right? They present findings,
Mm.
and those findings prevent the developers from merging and deploying the code to production. And therefore, it goes back to the dev, and the dev then needs to reprompt and retest. And that just adds up the same cost, which is
Mm.
why getting it back to the original agent that writes the code is the best bang for the buck.
Mm. Yeah, I mean that makes sense. Well, I know recently you launched a product called Arnie AI at Arnica, and there are a couple of components: Agentic Rules Enforcer and AI SAST. For the business folks in the audience, which frankly is most of the audience, can you break that down more? I mean, what does it do? Why does it matter? What's the combination? What's the value of that combination?
So think about it this way. As we discussed about the more code, more risks, more
Mm,
reviews, this problem actually compounds with even larger organizations
okay.
where different development teams utilize different tools. So even if you said, "Hey, I want to
Mm,
configure something, I don't know, centrally with a Copilot," they will have snowflakes with Claude, and they will have something with Cursor. It's just the natural way that developers pick their own tools and
right.
run with them, right? The agentic rules enforcer is essentially a governance layer across the company
Mm,
that ensures that every new piece of code is written exactly as it is required to be written.
mm,
And the main challenge there, let's say that you have this file, you have those requirements set in a in a requirements document. Question is, how do you go and scale this across the enterprise?
mm,
And to scale this across the enterprise, you need a workflow engine that has enough context of, do you have this
mm,
file there, or which requirements do you need to inject into which repos, and when, and what would be the acceptance rate of the developers.
mm,
Keep in mind, developers are not measured on this. So you need to
mm,
find a way to win their hearts through the workflow. And this is exactly that piece that the agentic rule enforcer does.
mm.
It's a workflow, and you can
Yeah.
customize whatever you want in this markdown file.
Mm,
Okay, you can. By the way, if it's a CTO, the CTO can also take the same requirements, maybe append another section that says, from now on, every service that you deploy um, needs to have this level of formatting and needs to have a connection to our docs site,
mm,
and you name it, right? It will do exactly what you would tell it to do. It doesn't need to be security only. It was just developed by a security company
mm,
that now you can expand it to any center of excellence, CTO, VP of engineering type of an audience who wants to govern the agents.
mm,
That's one piece of it.
mm,
The and we know that there's no 100%, right? Like if you have a vulnerability,
right.
as I mentioned, it may repeat the same vulnerability if there is no viable fix for it.
Right.
Which then you need to come up with more of a central management and identification of anything that needs to be merged into production.
Mm,
Now, the world of scanning code before it goes to production is not new. You have linters, you have code quality scans, you have code security scans, and that exists for a while, and it can block the merges. Thing is that if you think about the world in which developers wrote code versus the world in which it's more of a hybrid approach, when developers write code, they typically already have some context about how the product works.
mm,
For example, if you have an e-commerce website and you need to check out to call the checkout API, you need to have items in the basket first. It's a
mm,
business understanding of how
yeah.
an application works. The application works. On the flip side, if you think about an agent that writes this code, the agent can say, well, I know that there's a new API that I need to call. I'll just write this API because it looks like other APIs, right?
Mm,
And the at this point, you need something that doesn't scan your code only for specific rules that were defined with a scanner. You need to scan the code for more of a intent, meaning,
mm,
and this is why we introduced the AI SAST or agentic code review capability that essentially scans the code with both the deterministic rule-based capabilities that we want them to be consistent across the board, and appends either context to the deterministic piece or creates new findings in Arnica that, and obviously presented to the developer in the pull request, that essentially get the developer to rethink, reprompt if needed, the fix. A very typical example that we see is missing authorization, by the way. You developed an endpoint, let's say an admin management endpoint, and you did not include the proper authorization check. Mm-hmm. So we actually identify this type of a risk, right? It's more logical. Mm-hmm. There's no rule-based scan that can identify the specific issue.
Well, so for the agentic rules enforcer, you're injecting secure coding instructions into like whatever tool the developer's using, like Cursor, Claude, GitHub, Copilot, whatever, without the developer having to install something. So that's different than just doing like a pipeline-based scan, security scanning, right? So why did you go pipelineless, and are there trade-offs to that?
So I think that for code generation, I think this is actually the right place to put it. At the end of the day, it depends what the agent has access to. Okay, so in a pipeline, for example, the agent can pull other packages that you may have maybe in an internal package repository, or maybe clone other repos and build everything together. It happens in more complex build systems, and we've seen this happening. But when the agent is installed on your workstation, it already has the context. So if you run it locally, it's good. Where you will see the gap is if you do have both the complex build system and you go to a cloud agent that doesn't necessarily has the context, then you may suffer from not only lack of context for security, you will suffer from lack of context for building a regular functionality for your product, right? So therefore, there is room for pipeline-based scanning, but it's for very specific use cases. The vast majority of the use cases, you can do it in a pipeline-less way. You can do it at the code generation, and you can do it in real time based on events happening in your Git repositories. For example, when code changes before the code review, we get an event, we scan the code changes, and we interact with the developers. Or at the pull request, when code is reviewed, of course, you can do that. And you don't need to trigger based on a pipeline, not only because of, again, the context that I mentioned, but also there's, if you think about the business process, every time that you want to integrate a scanner into a pipeline, you have a dependency on the developers. You don't want this dependency. Developers can spin up repos all the time. And if you do this all kind of event-driven, you get 100% coverage immediately.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's built in versus having to remember to do it outside every time. Yeah.
Yes, think about it this way. It's like the difference between opting in and versus opting out, right? If it's an event-based, you can do a default opt-in, and only certain repos can opt out if you don't want them to be scanned. As opposed to an opt-in, a typical use case for this is installing a security IDE plugin or installing an MCP connector, right? All can be installed on your VS Code and other tools, but this is an opt-in functionality, which is exactly why security products have smaller adoption across developers. They don't want to install those tools.
Yeah. I mean, again, that makes sense. It takes away that extra step or action that they would have to take. You use this term or this little phrase that I thought was really great, that we're moving from vibe coding to viable coding. Well, what does a mature, secure AI-assisted development workflow actually look like for an enterprise that wants to, move fast without blowing up its risk profile?
I think that without blowing up the risk profile, I think that's the key.
Yeah.
I do believe that we will get to the place where software development can be autonomous. And by saying can be, it's not necessarily going to be autonomous across the board. And the way to think about it is that, I don't know, I wake up in the morning, I had a good dream about a feature. I go to my phone and I say, this is the feature that I want. And it interviews me for a couple of seconds. And by the time that I'm in the office, customers already get excited and post about it on LinkedIn. Like, ideally, that's where I want, right?
Yeah.
Now, if we need to break this down to what actually needs to happen, first of all, you need a workforce that can automate its own workflow. You need a workforce that has a product manager, maybe product analyst to clarify questions. You need an architect, you need a developer, you need a security reviewer, you need multiple agents to operate in their own order and get into a conclusion that this is ready. That, by the way, is today. You don't need to wait, right? It's there. By the way, I don't know if you saw, but there was an announcement of an interesting feature both by Cursor and Anthropic. They actually have something called computer use. Computer use means that, let's say that it generated code. Now it can actually spin up an environment and run the test cases like a QA. Yeah. And at least ensure the happy path is there, okay? And of course, make sure that everything passes, and then you have the code review stage. Now, to make this viable, you need a certain level of assurance that it actually addressed everything you asked and did not introduce any new bug or any new vulnerability. Right. That can be achieved by scanners, of course. And also, again, another fleet of agents that can verify this. They can go and check it against the Jira ticket and go and check the other conversations. Maybe you documented all of the development process in a file and it can read the file and ensure that nothing went sideways. You can do this, right? And there are going to be a subset of issues that you will want a human in the loop. And it's up to the agents to determine where is the human in the loop need to be involved. That is the piece that I think will need to be solved next in order to, to deploy smoothly into production. Because if you solved coding, you solved testing, and you solved review to some extent, but let's say you're there, the only thing you need is just a decision that says where a human is to be involved, and that needs to be as close as possible to deterministic. And then you can actually deploy production. Now,
so it's almost a threshold, right? So so if it's above this threshold, it needs human in the loop at this point?
Yes. And this is very simplified explanation for maybe a single service, right? But now think about a microservice architecture where you have multiple repos and multiple dependencies. That's where you may need to embed yourself in a pipeline. Again, it's possible, but a bit more challenging. And then you can say, okay, so I tested it with this service. Great. Is there any business criticality with other dependencies? Okay, if there is, we need a human in the loop every single time. As an example would be, any service that handles personal information or financial information requires a human to review this. But if you're looking at, even in financial services, and you say, you know what, if this is only, retrieving a page that exposes the options for you to order new checks and, apply for a loan, fine, maybe you don't need a human in the loop there. So only the classifying the risk is not only within the code changes, it's also with what matters for the business.
Yeah. So the function also drives, not that makes sense. Well, I know you hold 7 patents, I think, in software security now. So, obviously you're thinking about what comes next. So, what comes next in AI-driven development? And then what are the gaps that you see that really nobody seems to be addressing? Like, I guess the question is like, what keeps you up at night?
Um, in my mind, I think that there's going to be a proliferation of additional tools. I know
Mm,
that the foundation model companies are very few these days,
mm,
but you could also see that there's a lot of adoption of of the open source models, and you can deviate to new and other models. Um, as of today, developers really want the latest and greatest models, but I
yeah.
think that um, at some point, you will need to run multiple agents with multiple price points and different capabilities. And
Mm,
that will get you to the point that it's not only the foundational models, it's like every agent will need to do something different. An agent for understanding the business context. Maybe you'll train
mm,
by yourself. I don't know. Maybe that will be cheap.
right.
So eventually models will be more mature and will not necessarily require the latest and greatest for some use cases. And those use cases will likely be more risky from a governance standpoint, not from a security. It's just a company risk, right? An
Mm,
operational risk, a security risk. That's one piece. And I think that now is the time to build towards governing every agentic workflow within the development lifecycle.
yeah.
That is the point that has a lot of unknowns in it. And at the same time, I'm super excited to build towards governing every piece of those agents.
Mm,
The second piece is there's actually a quite a hype around what an agent can do. Like you could see, you know, Google DeepMind announced their security scanner in 2024. Then OpenAI announced their Aardvark scanner in 2025 in October, I think. And then a few weeks ago, we saw Claude with Claude Code Security. And I think there's also the challenge of educating the people that are not in the weeds on where are those gaps. Because you could say, oh, our AI will solve everything for me, right? AI will scan all of my code across the company. Um, and I think that uh, technically it is possible, but there's one thing that can block this from happening, and it's called money. the,
yeah.
the, the thought process is this: if it, let's say that this is a security scanner, right, and the security scanner costs maybe between $20 and $200 to scan a repo. Let's
Mm-hmm.
say, okay, because it can be a mono repo, it can be a small repo. Now, for for a security use case, you may need to scan not one, not two, not 10. You may need to scan hundreds or thousands of repos.
Mm,
Okay, so, and you typically use the latest and greatest because, again, you want to find the vulnerabilities and focus your time on it. And so there is a lot of room for optimizing this in the enterprise level. For example, as I mentioned, like the way that Arnica built this, we have a combination of more expensive and more cheaper models. So we kind of
mm,
almost built our own thinking in the product to decide what needs to be scanned, and we managed to get a repo of $20 to $3 to scan. Well,
mm,
now it is way more scalable, right?
right.
The other challenge is consistency, right? AI is inconsistent with its results. So how do you make sure that when you manage a backlog, which can be backlog of bugs, defects, can be backlog of security vulnerabilities, how do you make sure that the next scan, one, identifies what was fixed if it's not integrated into the workflow,
Mm,
or uh, it's the same issue. So how do you compare the similarities of, despite the fact that you have different findings in your code? So it boils down to
mm,
optimization and making it enterprise ready, and making it available, and ensure that maybe your agents can kick off other agents that the customer uses to address certain issues instead of reprompting, retesting. Like give the other agent the instructions to fix. So there's a lot of opportunities
Yeah.
to govern the agents
Mm,
uh, and make it really enterprise scale with a cost efficient approach.
mm. I mean, hearing you describe that actually reminds me of the way we've been talking about agents in general in the enterprise. This idea of a digital workforce, and thinking about the right sort of capabilities for each agent in the workflow in this specific use case. And it sounds like the same thing for a developer agent. I want a developer agent with this sort of skill set and capability, and for this kind of use case versus another. I mean, in a lot of ways it mimics the way we think about a human worker, right? I want to hire the right worker for the right task, and in some ways that works with agents as well.
Yeah, that's pretty much how it should be designed,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, it makes sense. Well, so for CISOs and security leaders who are listening and they're trying to get ahead of all this, what do you think the first conversation they should be having with their development teams are now? Where should they start?
Based on what I've heard from peers in the industry, and I have quite a lot of conversations with CISOs, CTOs, VP of
Mhm.
engineering. The first question is, what is my inventory? Where do I actually use different tools, and what tools am I using? This is something that is fairly easy to map because you can see fingerprints of those tools across all of the repositories in your company.
Right.
So that's an easy solvable problem, which of course we do that too at Arnica. This is the first scan that we do identifies those
Mm.
agents, and then the next question that you need to ask is, what are those agents doing? So maybe there's an opportunity to reuse certain agents across the company.
Mm.
It can be security agents, it can be quality, it can be documentation engines, it can be a lot of different things. We've
Mm.
seen companies with even a central repository of different, let's call it skills,
Yeah.
and they provide it as a value stream for the developers to use, which is, again, it's great. But if you provide it as a value stream, it's an opt-in. And
Right.
that's the opportunity to actually then decide, okay, what are those things that are optional and which requirements can be mandatory across the company. Whatever that is mandatory, you need a workflow to
Right.
apply this, right?
Yeah.
I think it boils down to figuring out what do you have and how to get a hold of the things that you believe that are the most useful across the company to potentially increase productivity, reduce friction between the different teams, and as a result of that, more features and hopefully more revenue.
Mm. Everything's moving so fast, and we've been talking a lot about, and I've written a fair bit about lately about governance by design, or the fact that we need to build governance in. And I, as fast as things are moving, it must be really difficult on the security side to keep security frameworks up with kind of where the capabilities and processes are, and governance too, I would assume. So how do you see that relationship between security tooling or agents and compliance, both regulatory and just generally governance inside of an industry? How does that evolve over the next couple of years, particularly in this, AI generated code area?
I think that everything is moving into asking the right questions,
Mm.
and it starts from coding. That you just need someone to interview you when you write, the code,
Right.
and it goes back to even governance, right? There are different frameworks and there are best practices, yes, and you can follow the different NIST frameworks and uh, scaled agile. That's going to be the next big thing with
Right.
AI. We'll figure what this thing is going to be, and I think that there's a lot of first of all thought leadership from the model companies, thought leadership from startups. Having a conversation with a startup is good for everyone, actually every leader, to take a conversation with the startup, because on one hand, they may think, yeah, startups just want to sell to me. But at the same time, startups are so married to the problem that it's almost not responsible to not take a meeting with a startup, right?
Yep.
And that may get you to obviously get more education, see what other companies are doing, and that's kind of the way to think about it, right? Governance will change between companies, but certain patterns will be repeated. Well, talk with the vendors; they will tell you. Go to events, meet peers, talk with them, see what they are doing. I think there's no one size fits all, but what you need is the right questions and the right customizability to answer those questions.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, for an analyst, for me, through the years, I've always found that exact, method helps greatly in the overall research and ability to talk to different vendors and different users, talking to startups and really understanding where they're coming from, where this is going. You get a real insight into the direction and even velocity of some of those changes that are coming. So that's great advice. So we're getting close to the end of our time, and great discussion. Really enjoyed this, but I wanted to ask this question I always ask at the end of, for a recommendation, somebody, a thought leader, or a podcaster, book, anything that you think would be really useful for the audience to check out.
So I think that it's unrelated to AI, but it's something that I love listening to those episodes. So I'm a big fan of the podcast called Acquired. Ben and David. I listen to almost every episode. They talk about tech companies, talk about retail and like really different businesses and how they succeeded and how they got to what they do. Specifically, as we're on the AI episode, there are 3 episodes on Google. And the latest episode is really about Google as the AI company. I would say one of the most fascinating episodes they had. It's in the top 3 that I listened to in Acquired. Other 2, by the way, are Costco and Visa. So phenomenal episodes. If you have the patience to listen to a 3-4 hour episode, absolutely a must.
Yeah, no, thanks. That's a great recommendation. And I've listened to a few of theirs as well, but you're right. Sometimes I run out of time or patience. Maybe it's more patience than time, but but anyway, no, thanks a lot. And really appreciate you joining today. Very, very interesting and very good information. So thanks a lot.
Thanks, Michael. Really appreciate it.
And that's the show for this week. Thank you all for joining us. Remember to like, share, and subscribe to the show. If you enjoy the show, please leave us a review to help others find us. For more research on AI and other software, check out arionresearch.com. If you're an expert in AI, generative AI, or business automation, either as a provider or an end user, email your information to disambiguation@arionresearch.com. Don't forget to join us next week. Disambiguation is an Arion Research production. I'm Michael Fauscette, and this is the Disambiguation Podcast.